On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Kim Wright-Vielich, your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Dr. Peter Doherty is the Michael F. Tamer Chair of Biomedical Research at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and professor at the University of Melbourne Medical School. In 1996, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Psychology or Medicine, and he is the only veterinarian to ever receive the Nobel Prize. The same year he won the Nobel Prize, he was also named Australian of the Year. He is a member of the Institute of Medicine, a foreign associate at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow at the Royal Society. His most recent books, Their Fate is Our Fate, How Birds Foretell Threats to Our Health and the World, and Pandemics, What Everyone Needs to Know, reflect his continued interest in infectious disease, particularly influenza, the subject of his research in both Memphis and Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doherty for discussion of pandemics and how they spread and what we can do to prevent them.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, Kim. And Kim is unfortunately suffering from a respiratory infection, but she read my pandemics book and she knows exactly what to do. Wash your hands regularly and keep your hands away from your face. Well, it doesn't matter in her case because you already got it. The motivation for writing these two books is kind of diverse. I was asked to write the pandemics book, and it's a question and answer book, really, and it's kind of infectious disease and immunity 101 focused towards pandemics. So when I sent the draft back to the publishers, they said, we don't understand any of this infection and immunity stuff, so you have to write a chapter on that, which added a considerable amount, and tried to write a chapter on the complexities of infection and immunity for an audience which I know in many cases will immediately close a book as soon as they encounter a technical term is kind of challenging. But the great thing about publishing books for a broader audience, for a scientist, is that the editors in publishing companies are all from the literary background, not from a science background. So one hopes if one can explain and satisfy their demands, which are very stringent, then you can get it through you can get your message through. So the Their Fate is Our Fate book, on the other hand, was several different things. I've been very interested for quite a while in issues to do with climate change and environmental degradation. But I'm a biologist, and the problem with climate change is a problem in the physical sciences. It's a problem that's studied by oceanographers and meteorologists, glaciologists, astrophysicists, cloud physicists, and all the rest of it. So I can look at what they're saying, but I'm not really close to it scientifically. But of course, the readout for what's happening with climate change that interests us is the readout that's going to be what happens with life forms, and that's the business of biology. And birds are the one species that all of us see, and not only are they the one wild species that all of us see, and we see them everywhere. We see them in cities, we see them in the country, we see them at the beach. They're also watched by a very large number of enthusiastic people, the people who are members of the Audubon Society and the various bird watching organisations through the world. And one of the consciousness that came to me as I wrote this book, because I wasn't a birder, I've started to look more at birds. I'm at that age in my 70s where I'm smelling the roses a bit more and looking at the birds and not being the typical obsessive compulsive scientists that we all know. But I wasn't a bird watcher, but this understanding of how important those organisations are for the science of birds was a new experience for me, and it introduced me to the idea of citizen science. What happens with the birds, there's no money in ornithology for research, but the ornithologists design studies, then they go to organisations like Audubon, who then recruit their members to accumulate the data that feeds back into that study, where the birds are, what the number numbers are. And there'll also be events where people go out in the same way as they go on archaeological digs, and they'll be involved in, say, cannon netting, where you fire balls out of 4 cannons and a big net goes over and comes down all over the birds, and you can then pick them up and weigh them and band them and look at their general health numbers. So that increased my interest in citizen science. And one of the things I've been trying to do since the Nobel Prize and since being Australian of the Year, which may seem an odd thing, but it got me onto the public scene where I was talking a lot to broader audience, which is a very brutal experience initially for someone who's a lab scientist. You know, I was really famous in science. Being really famous in science means that people in another area of science have no idea who you are when they come into a hotel or something. And I sometimes play that game when I come to a scientific meeting. There's been another meeting there the year before, and you try and identify who the really important people are by the cultural behaviour around them. And that's kind of fun. There's something on bird psychology in here, actually. But that got me into speaking on science. And we need to talk about science, especially biological science, especially in my field, because we've got all this kickback against vaccination. We're having measles outbreaks all over the world. We've just eliminated the cattle disease rinderpest. It's the second virus that's ever been eliminated. We've eliminated it by vaccination, and we've eliminated it from the planet. The other one, of course, is smallpox, which is some years back. Now, rinderpest and measles virus diverged about 1,000 years back, so they're very, very similar viruses. We've eradicated rinderpest. We can't eradicate measles because people won't vaccinate. And we could eradicate it. It's easier to eradicate measles than it is to eradicate polio. And we're getting close to eradicating polio, but we've been disrupted by wars and so forth. To get back to the birds, the other motivation for writing the bird books is I'd written a couple of books and I decided it was time to write a novel. And it's the worst novel that was ever written. It was a Jane Austen climate change murder mystery. and everything I did made it worse. So this was my get back on the bike for writing book. And I discovered recently there's been a couple of novelists who've written about their trade, and they said, I couldn't really write a good novel till I learnt to lie. You know, one of the things we don't do as scientists is lie, or not if we can avoid it anyway. So in the novel, not promising. So this will tell you a lot about pandemics, and I think pandemics is something, or global infectious disease is something we have to take enormously seriously. And when you talk about pandemics, you're not just talking about global infectious disease and the global infectious disease problem, because the problems the Gates Foundation, for instance, is interested in particularly are problems like childhood malaria and so forth. And they're not really pandemic threats. The big pandemic threat is influenza. That's the one we know about, and we get regular pandemics. We also get regular pandemics, and of course, we're still going through the AIDS pandemic. That's a long, long pandemic. It developed very slowly. We didn't recognize what was happening at first, and it's a slow pandemic. Influenza is a fast pandemic. The 2009 swine flu went around the world in no time at all. It was probably in Australia before we even identified the virus in the United States, where it originated out of American swine. The 1918-19 pandemic, you know, the one that killed 50 to 100 million people, didn't get to Australia till 1919, and the virus was already attenuated by then. I talk a lot about Australia because Australia's one country. It's the size of the continental United States. It's got 22 million people, and it has one government. It's the only continent that has that situation. And being so remote as it was in the days of the ships, we often learned from what was happening elsewhere. Australia is also the only place where we've really done some serious bioterrorism of late. You know, there was all this stuff about infecting the Indians with smallpox and all the rest of it, but we haven't been doing that recently, I think. But Australia, we had these 2 major bioterrorist episodes directed at rabbits. And we wiped out the rabbits with myxomatosis, and then when they started to get resistant, we brought in another virus called a Calici virus that then wiped them out again. The people in New Zealand who had an equal rabbit problem, the government decided we are not going to bring in this Calici virus. We will not release it. The farmers brought it across and released it. So they're the bioterrorists. So that's bioterrorism. I actually don't think, I mean, pandemic infections are something we have to be very concerned about. And one of the things I make a point of in the book is saying we need to support our public health infrastructure. We need to support the CDC. We need to support the United States Public Health Service. As governments and local administrations go ahead with the financial constraints and get rid of people, we need to make sure, and there's a lot of local democracy in this country, which is terrific, we need to make sure they don't get rid of the people who are doing public health, because they're really important and you put yourselves at risk. And so, I mean, a pandemic is not going to wipe out humanity. We had situations, say, in the 14th century, it's not a historical book, but in the 14th century, the plague would kill a half to a third of the population of cities. We've never seen anything like that. The 20th century, the worst pandemic, apart from HIV/AIDS, which has been going on, is the influenza pandemic. It killed about 2%, and that was bad enough. The other pandemic virus that comes around all the time, but none of us recognise it, is the norovirus, the thing that causes everyone to throw up on cruise ships and have a rotten vacation. And we have regular pandemics of that, but we don't talk about it as a pandemic much. The people in the field do, because it doesn't kill anybody. It's inconvenient and it's nasty and it causes economic loss, but it doesn't kill. So that sort of thing is all in this book, and it's a question and answer book, actually, which is an odd format to write in, because you lock yourself up in a room. Writing is very solitary compared with science. The practice of science, you're constantly going backwards and forwards to the people in your lab, you're working on papers, you're saying, did you do that experiment? And they get back to you. So it's very collegial to do science. But writing a book, you lock yourself away, and that's why a lot of authors become very peculiar, because they spend all day with themselves and they drink too much. And whereas we scientist authors are absolutely a delight for publishers to deal with, because we're kind of okay, and you know, we're just used to being beaten up by anonymous peer review all the time anyway. They reject our grants, they reject our papers. We're so used to rejection that even if someone is minimally nice to us, we're very pleased. And the pandemics thing is a question and answer book. So you sit all day in a room inventing questions and inventing answers. And if that is not the path to madness, I'd like to know what is, actually. So the bird book. There's not many copies of it here because of a glitch with the publishers, but it's available in all good independent bookstores, I'm told. And all independent bookstores are good, so I shouldn't say good independent bookstores. It's about lots of different things. It's stories about birds. Because I'm a vet, and the only vet to win a Nobel Prize, I get asked to talk at a lot of veterinary schools. And I also get to talk at a lot of medical schools, but I know all the stuff these guys are doing because I've been doing medical research for 40 years. But the vet schools I'm a bit remote from, and you get all these interesting stories. And so I'd ask them for stories. And there's wonderful stories out there. For instance, stories that many of you may know, but I didn't know at all. The fact that the Hawaiian Islands have lost about half their bird species because of avian malaria. And this is not due to the avian malaria coming in, it's because the mosquito vector came in about 1820. And there's a wonderful account by a clergyman who was a missionary there of how a ship watered and they emptied their barrels and they saw wrigglers in the stream. And that was the mosquitoes coming in. And the paradise that was Hawaii was brought to an end by mosquitoes. Of course, they didn't know until the turn of the 20th century almost that malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. That was worked out by a Scottish doctor in the British Indian Civil Service called Ronald Ross. And he worked that out in birds. He was studying malaria in humans, and then he got transferred to a region where there was no malaria in humans. But he remembered that people had found malaria in birds. He worked out how malaria transmits and replicates and all the rest of it in birds, and then he won the Nobel Prize. And so you can look at all the Nobel Prize lectures and all the Nobel Prize biographies online. Everyone's had to write a biography and a lecture. They're all online. They weren't online in 1900. They used to be in a book, obviously, but they've all been put online. And you can actually read his Nobel lecture, which is wonderful. I mean, it's just as like someone writing today. The thought processes, the enthusiasm, the delight in finding things are just what you would expect from a good scientist today. Ronald Ross also wrote poetry and plays. his poetry is god-awful, I can tell you. But and there's one piece in the book, because he didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature. There's stories about why all the Indian vultures are dying, or have died. We've lost 95% of the Indian vultures. And this again was a story that I didn't know until a guy told me in South Africa when I was there to give a lecture, because he was a pharmacologist who'd been involved in working this out. And why were these birds all dying? Well, they were dying with visceral gout. They were opening these birds up in India, and they were finding that they were, instead of the sort of livery colour and tissue colour, they were completely white. And they were loaded with uric acid crystals. So something was destroying their kidneys. And birds excrete uric acid, not urea the way we do, which comes out in solution. So, the typical bird glop that drops. The bird has no control. It doesn't have a bladder. It just drops this stuff. Well, a lot of that's uric acid, and that's why it's white. So what was destroying the kidneys? Well, they thought initially it must be a virus. They looked hard for a virus. They found a few viruses, but that wasn't what was doing it. And then they thought about it, and it was groups from, I think, Oregon and the UK and the Indians and Pakistanis who worked this out. They thought about it, and they thought, well, what do vultures do? Well, vultures are the main carrion consumers in India. I mean, major carrion eaters here, of course, are your iconic bald eagle. If you go up to those northwest salmon streams in winter, when the salmon run and die, it's the bears and the bald eagles that are cleaning them up. I think that imperial eagle thing that goes right through cultures from Rome through the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the United States doesn't really think of those birds as sanitation workers. They've got a different connotation, but sanitation doesn't go with imperialism, but it sure goes with infectious disease. And so what was it? So they thought, well, what are the vultures eating? And they said, well, they eat the dead cattle, because in India, because of the sacred cow thing, the cattle just fall, and then they're stripped by vultures. And what it was, they found, is they'd started to use a human drug called Voltaren, or diclofenac, in the cattle, and the vultures were stripping the cattle, and Voltaren, diclofenac, is totally toxic for the vulture kidney. One dead cow could kill about 900 feeding vultures. And my friend in South Africa reproduced it in African vultures because they weren't having the problem. So you kill all the vultures. What's the issue there? Well, they're not very nice birds. Who loves a vulture? Well, unfortunately, if you kill all the vultures, something has to strip the cattle, and it's dogs. And they got many more wild dogs, which means, and rabies is active in India, they got 50,000 excess rabies deaths. And the other thing is, and they brought that under control a lot by vaccinating and by neutering the dogs. But the other thing is that the Parsi put out their dead on stone tables of silence to be stripped by vultures, and there's no vultures. So you've got a big human disposal problem as well. So it's simply a good story of how the relationships all come together in these ecosystems to give you a potentially disastrous consequence. I talk about heat and climate change, the effect on bird eggs, which is problematic. Birds that don't move are particularly threatened by climate change. Birds that are migrating towards the equator are tending not to come as far south or as far north, depending on which hemisphere you're in, all that sort of effect. Birds don't sweat. They're very susceptible to heat. Some birds won't move. Birds that sit on the top of mountains won't move. And insectivorous birds are often very local, and they're very down in numbers already, so we're very worried about them. Seabird numbers are down by about 50%. There's a story that many of you know. It was a PBS documentary of the red knot that flies from Argentina to breed in the Arctic and refuels on horseshoe crab eggs in the Delaware, and how that was threatened because the horseshoe crabs are being used as fish bait or as bait for whelks and so forth. So that story's in there. There's a story about bird psychology. I was asking around, when I was travelling around, I was visiting the UK, and I was talking in the University of Cambridge. And I asked around, is anyone here working on birds? And one of my friends does work on birds. He works on bird genetics and so forth. And that's in the book. That's one of the more technical chapters. If you buy the book, that's one you might want to skip. And actually, it's pretty interesting if you can get into it. But they introduced me to a woman called Nikki Clayton. And here's this rather attractive lady. She's a fellow in one of the colleges. She buys me lunch. And we sit down and talk afterwards. And she's a bird psychologist. She's an FRS, which means she's a fellow of the Royal Society, which is equivalent to the National Academy of Sciences, the oldest English-speaking national academy, in fact. So she's a very classy scientist, and she's a very classy lady. And she's a former ballerina, and she writes ballet for Ballet Rambert. And she's also a tango dancer. So this is a woman, you know, a lot of women sort of blow me away with their enormous abilities, this one particularly. But she's a bird psychologist, and she studies caching behaviour in corvids. Now, crows and jays and those birds don't migrate, but they hide food. If they're in the colder latitudes, they hide food to get them through the winter. And they'll hide 2,000 pieces of food, and they can remember where that food is. So if you say you're a bird, I can't remember where my car keys are, let alone 2,000 pieces of food. I know where the refrigerator is, but I don't always remember to shut the door. But and she describes a really neat experiment. And what she does is she has two cages side by side, and she has one with a lot of western scrub jays in, and another with just one scrub jay. And these birds are overlooking the single bird. So she gives the single bird food, and she gives the bird two trays, one full of pebbles and one full of sand. Now, if the bird is conscious that the other birds are watching it, it hides the food in the pebbles, because it would be noisy to recover that food. If she puts a curtain down between the two, so the bird can hear the other birds, but knows that it's not being overlooked, it will hide the food silently in the sand. And I think that's really neat. So I'm you know, if I had another life, I'd either work on zebrafish or bird psychology. It's kind of a fun area. Lots of other stories, the lead poisoning of the condors and the problem with bald eagles with rifle bullets. Birds pick up lead shot. There's something like 70,000 tons of lead shot deposited on American fields every year. You know, if you shoot with a shotgun, very little of it hits the bird, if you hit it at all, and most of it falls to earth, and that's a problem. And birds they pick up stones to put in their gizzard, and that helps them to grind their food. And if they pick up lead shot or a lead sinker, which happened with the loons, then that will kill them from lead poisoning. And so that's a real concern. So there's also the story of West Nile virus, which took 4 years to go across the United States in a bird bird-insect life cycle, really. We're just an incidental host. Did enormous damage to your yellow-tailed magpies. There were big losses with them. And of course, we had another outbreak last year. So that story's in there as well. So it's lots of stories about birds and what's happening with birds, and a lot about influenza. There's 3 chapters on influenza, how we worked out that it's basically a disease of water birds, and the people that worked it out, and how influenza works and why it's a threat and all the rest of it. So I don't know. How am I going for time, Jim?
You're doing well. You've got another 10 minutes.
I've got another 10 minutes, so I can go on for ages. What should I tell you about? There's a story, a friend of mine, when I did my PhD in Scotland, and I was a veterinary pathologist, that's what I did, and looked at diseases in animals. And a friend of mine that worked very closely with me, Hugh Reid, was a virologist. And we worked together on a project on a virus infection of sheep called Laupingal infection. Then years later, I caught up with him, and he told me about the work he was doing. And what he'd been doing was studying the massive deaths they'd been having in the grouse. Now, grouse are a small wild bird that flies out very fast from the ground, and it's a great target for hunters. And so it's traditionally been a target for the aristocracy in Britain. They used to hunt grouse. I think it was Edward VII, maybe it was George V, shot something like 1,000 grouse in 3 days. There was one guy who actually was a record grouse shooter, and he trained in the summer by shooting insects. And he had 2 loaders. You know, they use these single-barreled Purdy shotguns, which are enormously expensive anyway. And he would have 2 loaders loading for him as he shot these things. And there's a whole bunch of these guys who are actually record keepers. They all have hyphenated names, you know, Smith Codgley or something, you know, very British, very British. So shooting birds is kind of heaven for the hyphenated. And so a lot of these guys went off to the First World War with great patriotic vigour and got killed, of course. And the culture actually requires that you have beaters. because the betas, I'll talk about that a bit later, but my friend Hugh worked out that the virus, what was happening with the grouse and what was killing them was this virus, Laupingal virus, the virus we'd studied way back in the 1960s, in fact. And he suggested various solutions. It seems that Laupingal virus was brought into Scotland, where the big problem was, in the Scottish Highlands, because grouse shooting is a big industry in the Scottish Highlands, and the Scottish Highlands are very poor. So if they lost the industry, there'd be a real problem. A shooter on a grouse moor pays $15,000 a day to be a gun. So really, it's an occupation for Arab sheikhs and financiers and criminals, really. I mean, that's who do it. And so, so he worked out that, that basically it was this virus that was killing them. So he developed a solution. The virus was, it comes from ticks. It's a tick-borne encephalitis virus, not a mosquito-borne like West Nile, tick-borne. And so it's in the ticks, and when the ticks fall off the sheep, so sheep get infected, sheep die. That's why we were studying it, because we were working in a place that studied diseases of sheep. Sheep die, but the ticks, the birds pick up the ticks because they think they're seeds. The birds are vegetarian, but they can't tell the difference between a tick and a seed, so they eat it, and they get infected when they eat these things. The virus was probably brought to Scotland by the monks when they imported sheep in about the 15th or 16th century it was, and those highland clearances were already starting for grazing. So his solution was actually to use the sheep as a tick mop. You can vaccinate the sheep, then the ticks all come onto the sheep, and then you dip the sheep and kill the ticks off. And that's one solution to try and pick up a lot of these ticks. So they got it more or less under control, and things were going well. But the story is, the other story that's there is a story I got from my friend Ian Fraser, who's the scientist, a Scottish scientist who works in Australia, who developed the human papillomavirus vaccine that's sold by Merck, the Gardasil vaccine, and he did the basic science of it, and then it was taken up by Merck, and we've got this vaccine. So he's a very, very good and very famous scientist, actually. So Ian grew up in Aberdeen, and when he was a kid, he used to go, and his vacation job was being a beater on the grouse moors. The beaters used to be the local peasants, but they all got killed in the First World War too, so they got rid of them, and so they had to use schoolboys. And then later they started to use schoolgirls as well, which probably made it a lot more fun for everybody. But they would sort of stay in the little crofter cottages where the workers used to live. And their job, the job of the beaters, is to walk behind towards the guns. I mean, the guns are there, shotguns. The loaders are standing behind them. The guns, if they're English, will have drunk a lot the night before, and they never hit anything. Sometimes they hit the beaters, and they only got 5 pounds for every bit of lead shot that was taken out of them. And, but if they were Germans, they didn't shoot the beaters, they shot the birds, and they stayed sober because they're very systematic. But so the beaters are beating behind the grouse, causing them to fly towards the guns. And the guns are up and shooting because these things come out fast. And then at a certain point, my friend Ian, who did this for several years, was made head beater. And he had to carry a ram's horn, which he blew like the horn of Gabriel. And then the guns were supposed to, instead of shooting towards the grouse, towards the beaters, were supposed to turn away from the beaters and shoot backwards as the birds went that way, which of course they got a loader standing behind them, so they've got to be careful not to blow his head off. And so that was his vacation job, which I thought was pretty neat. He said the status of a beater on a grouse moor was about somewhat lower than the dogs, actually. So that wasn't exactly a high prestige job. So enough about the books. More?
No, you're good.
More about pandemics. Pandemics has a thing at the end which sort of summarizes what I think the threat level is from pandemics. I'm not, you know, the books about pandemics or about infectious disease tend to be high fear books. They study some hideous infection, and there are many hideous infections out there. And they sort of titillate us by this sort of fear thing. I think actually when you come to pandemics, the threats are kind of limited, and there could be something out there we don't know about. There could be a real danger. Did anyone see the movie Contagion? It was probably the best movie on an infectious disease episode that we've seen. I mean, Outbreak, the other movie, is really, really god-awful. I mean, it's really terrible. But Contagion's pretty good. And it was made by Steven Soderbergh, who was a very good director, and Ian Lipkin, infectious disease physician at Columbia, who's also been involved in working out this Middle East coronavirus that's been problematic recently, very closely related to SARS. Ian Lipkin sort of had the scientific say. So on the whole, it's pretty good. I mean, there's a few things in it. I mean, they've got this hideous disease, which is worse than anything we've ever seen. It's like the plague of the 14th century, and they've got about 3 people working on it, so that's a bit odd. And then they develop a vaccine, and overnight, the scientist injects the vaccine. The next day, she's immune, which it takes a bit longer than that. So there are a few things wrong, but it's really a pretty good movie, and we get to see the top of Gwyneth Paltrow's head removed. I mean, not really. I mean, it's a dummy, but she brings the virus back to the United States. One of the things we've realised over the last decade or so, since SARS, is there are a lot of viruses in bats, not just biting bats. We knew there was rabies virus in vampire bats, but there's also a lot of viruses in fruit bats, and that's the virus that caused SARS. It was multiplied through a little animal called a Himalayan civet cat, which is sold in live animal markets in China. And then some Chinese caught it. It was Chinese New Year. They carried it, and there was some super spreaders, and they spread it all over the place. SARS was the big wake-up call for global infectious disease, because it caused about $50 billion of economic loss. And it also made really powerful people realise that powerful people get sick from respiratory infections too. It's not just the poor. So that was an important realisation. But the realisation of these viruses in bats, we're now finding a whole lot of them. There's probably the one in the Middle East, though that's a bit disputed. There are 2 in Australia and Southeast Asia called the henipaviruses, and actually the virus in Contagion is based on those 2 viruses that were studied at the Australian Animal Health Lab in Geelong, near where I live. And they actually made he made a kind of amalgam of them to create this virus. What happened with poor Gwyneth is she was at a business meeting in Hong Kong, and they had a dinner, and she shook the hand of the chef. And the chef had just dressed a pig which had been infected with one of these viruses. And that's what they seem to work. They multiply through another species, and then we get infected. The Hendra virus in Australia multiplies through the horse. If you read the book Spillover, which is a really nice book written by David Quammen, which will terrify you, he talks about the Hendra virus, actually, which has only actually killed several people. But Gwyneth gets infected. She comes back to the US. She's not feeling well, but she drops off in Chicago, where the plane lands, and has a bit of a liaison there. And then she comes on to Minneapolis, and everybody who has anything to do with this woman dies. You just got to open the car door and you die horribly a few days later. So no, we don't have an infection that's quite like that out there at the moment, fortunately. Though the thing with SARS is it survived very well on surfaces, so that was another good reason for washing your hands. And so the story of SARS is in the pandemics book. It was a really big wake-up call for governments, because they were reminded what incredible economic damage a pandemic can cause. If we got a severe influenza pandemic, the minimal estimates are in excess of $300 billion in economic loss. So it's a massive effect, because it shuts down the hotel. What happened in Singapore, Hong Kong and Toronto, it shut down the hotel industry, people stopped flying. It just has a massive, massive economic impact. And so pandemics, and I also talk about the economic impact of veterinary pandemics, because one of the most devastating things for a country like Australia or the United States would be an epidemic of foot and mouth disease. And that's one target for bioterrorism that would actually work. Thinking about bioterrorism, I don't, and I talk about it, but I don't think infectious disease bioterrorism, apart from anthrax, which worked very effectively, very easy to come by, easy to distribute, a very good terror weapon. But infectious diseases are not good military weapons, and the military has no interest in them, and there's a convention that says you're not supposed to use them. So I'm not all that of a mind that anyone's going to use these things for bioterror. The main worry would be bringing back smallpox virus, and anyway, and I discuss that scenario too in the book. So I think probably that's enough from me, is it?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
We have a lot of good questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with, because I think it's the most provocative of the questions we've received, what is the scariest case of disease that you have seen, whether it is human or animal?
I haven't seen any of the really horrifying diseases. These are the sort of diseases that are studied by CDC people in Atlanta, or their people go to countries like Africa, Ebola outbreaks. The scariest diseases are these hemorrhagic fevers because, you know, you're bleeding from all over, there's black stuff coming out. It's a bit like the disease in outbreak, you know. They're horrible diseases. But the thing is, most of these diseases can be pretty well contained by good barrier nursing. Just really good nursing, the nurses properly protected, everyone properly protected. Of course, the people may die because there's no vaccines and there's no really good treatment. But you can stop their spread because they're not respiratory. That's why influenza is such a disaster, because with influenza, when you're infected first, you feel reasonably okay. And you get on a plane and you travel, but you're coughing up lots of virus. And so you're very infectious. Now, that doesn't mean it goes through the plane. The science that's been done says that you're at risk if you're within 2 to 3 seats of someone who's coughing and spluttering. You're more at risk if you're in an aisle seat. But it doesn't go through the air handling system of the plane. The air handling system handles it. But planes spread flu because they spread people with flu. You know, even though flu is basically a disease of birds that occasionally jumps into us, we're not at risk from birds on the whole. And we get it from other people. We can get it from pigs. Last year there was a Hong Kong flu type, an H3N2, which has been, that type of virus has been circulating in us since 1968 and keeps changing with the mutation. There was a virus like that in pigs in the Midwest that was coming out and infecting people. But you had to get really friendly with a pig. I mean, you had to get up close to the pig and smile at it. You had to be a pig fancier. And it didn't spread between pigs. You don't have to kiss the pig. I mean, there is actually one of the favorite pictures that flu virologists like showing is a picture of a kid kissing a pig, but you don't have to kiss it.
Well, one of the questions that we received was, are there other animals? You've mentioned bats, you've mentioned birds, you've mentioned pigs. Are there any other animals that jump species?
Oh, that carry viruses that jump species, yes. We just had an outbreak of cynombre up in Yosemite last year, I think it was. They're carried by a field mouse. Korean hemorrhagic fever. When we put a lot of troops into Korea during the Korean War, and they're sleeping out, there's a little field mouse type animal that carries a hemorrhagic fever that's very similar. And there are a lot of these things in South America and so forth. So mammalian viruses. We get influenza from birds. We get psittacosis from birds. That's a very minor problem, actually, but it had a very major effect, and that story's in the book too. And it's a story that was very nicely told in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore. And that is, there was a 1929-30, right at the time of the economic panic, there was a parrot panic. And thousands of parrots were killed because some people in Baltimore caught psittacosis from their parrot and they died. This is pre-antibiotics. And so everyone got very terrified, and everyone wrote about it. H.L. Mencken said it fed into the great national hypochondria. But the positive effect of that parrot panic, and all these parrots gave their lives, was that the people working on it were in the health laboratory in Washington. And actually 2 of them died, and another one got very sick, so they were really hands-on public health guys. But that caused them to set up the National Institutes of Health. And so it was the parrots that started the NIH. And the NIH is the biggest funder of biomedical research anywhere in the world, and it's wonderful. And, you know, biomedical science would not have gone at anything like the rate it has if it wasn't for the NIH and the parrots.
Well, speaking of institutions in the health industry, one question was, how effective do you think the World Health Organization is at preventing or containing pandemics, specifically the exclusion of certain states?
The WHO does as well as it can. I mean, it's under all sorts of constraints. It has no real power, and that's true of all UN agencies. It can get a problem at times because of the politics of appointing people. But on the whole, the WHO is one of the better functioning world agencies. It functions a lot better than the OIE, the Organisation Internationale des Épidémiques, and it functions a lot better than the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, both of which function but not particularly well. WHO does pretty well. It's based in Geneva, and it's the WHO influenza network that's fantastic. I mean, their AIDS network is good too, but the influenza network is the one that monitors flu all the time. We have WHO reference centres in London, Atlanta, Melbourne, Tokyo, and now Beijing. The concentration in that area reflects that they tend to come out of Asia, though the swine flu, of course, came out of Mexico. And so they're really on top of it. And the technology is fantastic, and it gets better all the time. And that's the other thing why I think with global infectious disease, we're doing reasonably well, because our technology in 2013 is infinitely better than the technology in 2002 when we got SARS. We've really moved way ahead. So they monitor for flu, and it's the WHO influenza guys that really worked out SARS. They all talk to each other, they meet twice a year, they design the viruses that are going into the vaccines in the southern and northern hemisphere. Sometimes they get one wrong and we get a lot more flu, but they do pretty well.
So another person asked, why is it that we could respond so quickly to the avian flu crisis in China and it takes the FDA so many years to approve antiviral drugs?
Well, the avian flu crisis in China, there have been two flu crises. One is the H5N1, which went right through China, started in 1997. It's so far infected about 600 people, killed about 60% of those. So it's not very infectious, but very lethal if you get it. But you have to get it deep into your lung to get a severe infection. But it's probably killed several hundred million to even 1 billion poultry, either by killing them or by having to destroy them. So it's caused enormous economic loss in countries that are very poor. And so that reaction has been problematic, and the virus still continues. And of course, the virus mutated, probably in chicken houses, got into water birds. Flu is a disease of water birds. The reason is flu virus in water birds is a gastrointestinal tract infection. The virus survives very well in water, and so it's a perfect way to transmit a virus or maintain a virus, because you've got all sorts of different species, you know, ducks and geese and swans and flamingos, and they're as different from each other as we are, say, from cows or pigs. And so some species will be highly susceptible, some won't, if you get a virulent strain. And when we got that virulent flu virus that everyone was worried about, that kills all these birds, it was carried west by the ducks, which weren't badly affected. And it's been killing chickens in Asia and in Egypt and Europe and all the rest of it. So the Chinese have gotten much better at responding, and they're responding at the moment to this H7N9 flu, which looks very dangerous because it's coming out of birds, but the birds aren't clinically affected like the H5N1. They're clinically normal, so you can't really pick them. But it's killed about 20% of the people it's infected, mainly older men, and you wonder about their other intercurrent problems. Likely Chinese, likely heavy smokers, maybe that's an issue. But also there's an interferon gene defect in a lot of these cases, and that's been found. So that's basically a science problem. The antiviral drug thing, it's the same problem as we have with all therapeutics. It's the problem of trying to make sure that everything is absolutely safe. And we've got much, much more concerned about that as time goes by. And we don't want to put a drug out there that's going to cause more damage. But I think if you've got a really severe pandemic and you developed an antiviral drug, it'd be out there pretty fast, quite frankly. I mean, you know, the Hendra virus in Australia, for instance, they developed a vaccine for horses, but there's none for people. But the people at risk are particularly veterinarians, because the virus goes from bats into horses and then vets. I bet every vet that handles horses has injected himself with the Hendra vaccine, though it's not approved for human use. I would.
So I'm going to circle back to the birds and away from the horses. Do you think the destruction of the chickens in Southeast Asia agricultural areas was effective?
It would normally be. Normally, if you cull chickens, that are infected with an avian influenza virus, you solve the problem. It hasn't worked. I mean, it slows it down, but the virus keeps coming back. And that is because the high path virus, the pathogenic virus, is in the water birds, and they keep reintroducing. So it's really important. What happened after the Second World War is countries like the US and Australia helped Southeast Asia particularly to develop big chicken industries. They wanted to increase the availability of high-value protein, and so they developed chicken industries. And some of the practices with that are all wrong, because with the chickens, this is where a lot of the mutation that brings more virulent flu viruses happens. So it's happening in the chicken industries. So what should be absolutely forbidden is to have a duck pond that brings in water birds near a chicken house. And the other problem is they use a lot of the effluent from the chicken houses. They wash them out. They've been putting it on rice paddies, and of course the water birds come in onto the rice paddies. And so we've got to break that chicken water bird connection. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to kill out the H5N1. It's controlled, but it's not killed out. It's still active in Indonesia. We still have fatal human cases every year.
Besides polio, what infectious diseases do you consider a good candidate for eradication?
Well, measles would be the primary one, which we mentioned, if we could get people to vaccinate. In the veterinary world, we're probably going after the eradication of a virus related to rinderpest called petit peste des ruminants. And that may be the next eradication target. There's also some desire to try and eradicate foot and mouth, which is related to poliovirus actually, but the vaccine's generally not as good. So they're the candidates around at the moment. But it would be wonderful if we could eradicate measles, but we have to get people to vaccinate.
What do you think are the cultural obstacles to doing that, to getting people to vaccinate?
Oh, there are all sorts of things. One is, all the information and misinformation that's on the web. Then, you vaccinate. Firstly, think about vaccination. A young mother who's never seen measles or polio or any of these diseases, unlike people of my generation who all had these things, is asked to take a child along and to be injected. Perfectly normal child, it's injected with something. It can make the child grumpy, and so she gets upset about that. And then, unfortunately, sometimes things do go wrong. We had a situation in Australia with an influenza vaccine which was a bit more reactogenic than it usually is. That is, it caused a bit more fever because of some of the components. And we don't test every influenza vaccine as thoroughly as we do something that's completely novel, because we'd never get it out there in time if we did. And so a number of kids developed actually convulsions. Small children will go into convulsions very early, very quickly, if they get fever. It's commonplace, and at least one child seemed to have had some permanent damage. So that vaccine was withdrawn very quickly, but that's why it's very important that vaccine side effects get reported fast. But of course, when they're reported, people pick up on it and say vaccines are not safe. The other issue is the paper that was published about the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, which claimed a link with autism. It was a total of 11 cases. It's now known that those cases weren't really quite legitimate in some senses, but it's caused many people to believe that the MMR vaccine causes autism. So the other issue is, of course, if you vaccinate hundreds of thousands of children and someone develops something within a month, even 2 months, even 6 months, people blame the vaccine. There'll be a very good documentary out next year on PBS called Jabbed. It's an Australian documentary made by a lady, Sonia Pemberton, and it's very good on this, and it includes some American interviews. They're currently Americanizing it, changing a few of the scenarios, and it will be out next year, but do try and see it and recommend it to people, because it's very sane. Paul Offit, who's a friend who developed the rotavirus vaccine and has written several books, and written one exactly on the MMR vaccine, summarised all the evidence, all the detailed studies that have been done saying that there is no risk with this, got death threats when he published his book. It's so embedded in the culture. And the other thing is, of course, some of the major TV people are against vaccination. And so Paul refuses to go on daytime TV. He says, you've got a woman interviewing you, you've got an attractive young woman who says, my baby had a problem due to the vaccine, and you come in as a middle-aged guy and say, oh, well, this is and firstly, you're disrespectful of this poor woman. And he says, you absolutely can't win. I mean, you're just there's no way you can do it. So I'm trying to talk to graduate students, and we've got to get attractive young women with babies who are completely normal and have been vaccinated out there on these talk show circuits. We don't need old guys.
I think attractive young women are kind of a theme with you, because I remember when you got the Nobel Prize and you said that a woman in a white coat was one of the reasons you entered science. Is that not true?
It's absolutely true, actually. I went to the veterinary school at age 17. This is in Australia. You go straight from high school, you don't go through college, and you go to veterinary school or professional school, straight out of school, medical school. It's changing now. We're going to a sort of college-type structure and making these courses postgraduate. If I'd done that, if I'd gone to a good American college, I'd be a historian or a political scientist or something, I don't know, but probably a high school teacher, I don't know, something. But so I didn't know what to do with myself, and the state of Queensland when I grew up was the state of the big agricultural veterinary industries. And I was very good at French and literature and all these things, so I decided to be a vet. Why did I decide to be a vet? Well, I was reading Hemingway, Sartre, and Aldous Huxley simultaneously. And I was still a bit religious, so I was the most confused kid on earth. And as you know, this is a 16-year-old boy. And, any woman and girl knows 16-year-old boys should never make decisions about anything at all. I mean, they're totally mad. And so I went along to the open day at the local vet school. I could have studied medicine, but I didn't want to be in a suburban doctor's office, and I thought I didn't like sick people. I didn't realise a lot of doctors don't like sick people either. And anyway, you do grow more sympathetic as you get older. And so I went along to the vet school, and it was very interesting. I really found it fascinating, but what's most fascinating is the demonstrator in the embryology lab was about 2 years older than me. She's a very pretty girl. And it was mid-Australian summer, and she seemed to be wearing a lab coat and nothing else. And I was a 16-year-old boy, and I thought, this is for me.
So a Nobel Prize is won from that. Okay.
She actually went on and she married a lecturer, did a PhD late in life, and I believe has done quite well. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. So I'm going to change the subject.
She wouldn't have even looked at me, spotty youth.
How can technology help track and prevent pandemics? Talk a little bit about Google's application for tracking flu.
There, I'm not totally up on Google's application for tracking flu, which really is something I only actually became more aware of it later. The problem with writing a book on pandemics, it's a vast subject, and it would be written very differently by an epidemiologist rather than by someone like me who's interested in the infectious diseases themselves. And so I'm not totally up on the Google story. The WHO tracks flu very closely, and they're constantly sampling. And as soon as the virus isolates are sent in from national labs to the WHO centres, and now with deep sequencing, we can get the sequence of these things very, very fast. We used to have to type these with antibodies and stuff. Now it's all done by sequencing. So it's very, very rapid. And we're looking, all the time, we're looking for drug-resistant variants. We're looking for new variants that look dangerous.
You talk in your book about fast pandemics and slow. Is one more common, and is one harder to cure?
I think a fast pandemic is like a flu pandemic, where the whole thing is really out there. You know what's happening very fast. People get infected. Most survive, and they only excreting the virus fairly early on. It's not a persistent virus, except in some cases where, say, you get someone who's on anti-cancer drugs. Then the virus can persist for quite a while, and we've seen that in some children who are on anti-cancer medication and stuff, and we get a lot of mutants out of them. But it doesn't usually kill them, which is interesting because it's a lot of the host response is the damage in flu. And that's one of the things we're learning now is how to handle it a whole lot better. Now I'm losing my track. What was the question again?
I got distracted as well.
I got totally distracted.
So why don't we pick another question, which is...
I didn't answer, but anyway, yeah, okay.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
The question was fast and slow pandemics.
Fast and slow pandemics. So flu is a fast pandemic. We know it's happening. It happens fast. The swine flu was around the world in a matter of months. Seasonal influenza is across America in 6 weeks. And that's airplanes. Whereas with West Nile virus, going from bird to mosquito, took 4 years to get from New York to California. It got went south quicker because that's the migration pattern for the birds, but it went west much more slowly. So flu's a fast pandemic. A slow pandemic is HIV, which started slow. It may have started, we think it may have started back in the 20s and 30s in the Belgian Congo, actually. And it probably someone butchering a chimp cut their hand and got infected with the chimp virus, because it's a chimp virus. It's clearly a chimp virus. And we think it may have really got going when they started urbanization in the Congo, and women were sort of having casual, it was really casual prostitution, and that kind of spread it in the urban environment. A bit the same practice happened in Thailand, actually, and the Thais turned around and introduced condoms in a big way and slowed the whole thing down. So that took a long while to develop, and we can identify, we didn't pick it up until 1981, and I think in San Francisco and New York we really first picked it up, and it was, but there are isolates now from material that killed, from people who died in the 60s and 70s in Europe and the US. So it may have been going on for a long time. Just took a very, very long time to grow. And then, of course, it became this disastrous pandemic. But even so, you know, the great majority of people have never been infected with HIV. And so, you know, potentially, I mean, if it ever changed so that it became a respiratory infection, all of us are susceptible. But viruses rarely do that. Flu does it in birds. But it's not known a virus that's changed from one particular type of spread, I think, to another type of spread. And so that protects us, really. And the other pandemic is the sort of inapparent pandemic, like the norovirus, where we don't really take that much notice. The term pandemic is really defined by WHO as a measure of spread, but most people think of it as a measure of severity. They think a pandemic virus is terribly severe, but it's not really the measure that the professionals are using. The measure they're using is of spread.
So do you think that we should change the terminology? You talk in your book a little bit about the fact that because it's not about the intensity of the disease or the seriousness of the disease, but about the spread, that sometimes the public responds as if there have been a false alarm.
The public got some elements in the media and public got very angry with WHO for calling the 2009 swine flu a pandemic. They were defining it on the criteria that they have for pandemic spread, which is that it spreads between more than 2 WHO regions. It's not a very good criterion in a sense, because the WHO regions are not geographic. They're illustrated in the pandemics books. They're basically more to do with population densities and where the offices are and all the rest of it. But basically, if a flu virus spreads between 2 regions, we know it's going to go everywhere. In fact, if we get a new flu virus emerging in a city, we know it's going to go everywhere. It will, and we don't seem to be able to stop it. So there was a certain amount of anger because it was felt it wasn't that severe, even though early on it killed a few people. It killed a kid in Toronto. I was in Toronto when a child died, and everyone was clamouring for the vaccine because it had just become available, and there wasn't enough vaccine. People were very angry because they couldn't get their kids vaccinated. Then 6 months later, people had decided it wasn't that serious, so you couldn't give the vaccine away. Now, was it that mild? Well, the reason it seemed mild was that people who were born before 1950, and they're usually the people who are most susceptible to flu, the elderly, people of my age, are most susceptible to flu because their immune systems fail just like everything else as we get older. And so people that were alive before 1950 had been infected with a cross-reactive virus, and they still had immune memory. And we knew immune memory lasted after the 1918 thing. We knew that people who'd survived in 1918, who were alive in 1976, I think, when a similar virus came back, were still protected. So there's very long memory to influenza. And so that group was out, so those people didn't die. I think in the US, about 350 children died, and a number of fit young adults were in intensive care. A lot of them, some people were saved on ECMO machines, the heart-lung type machines. About 50% who would have died were saved because of that. And pregnant women who were in 3rd trimester were very at risk. Also Indigenous communities in Australia and the USA, and also a tremendously high death rate in some developing countries, and particularly in India. So it didn't seem that severe to most Western communities, but it was very severe in some other communities. And so, you know, whether we should have a pandemic descriptor that sort of says, well, this is a level 5 pandemic or level 4 pandemic or whatever, but in severity it's level 1 or level 2 or level 3, whether we should have a double thing. But, you know, getting science across is difficult enough anyway, and people just get confused probably, so.
Well, thank you very much. Because that has been sort of an intense topic, I just wanted to end with one quote from his book, and I'm not going to read it exactly, but it was to not be fearful, but to be aware, watchful, and prepared. And I thought that was a more hopeful note to end on. That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Doherty for this excellent discussion. Many thanks as well to you, the audience, for terrific questions. I'd like to remind you that Dr. Doherty's books, Pandemic, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Their Fate is Our Fate, are available for sale, courtesy of Books, Inc., and he is available to sign copies on the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.